Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we wrap up your week with the gist of what went on in the past week. I'm Kim Dami in Seoul. Let's begin with a look back using some keywords. All right, it's about time that we say goodbye to masks. Wearing masks either indoors or outdoors will no longer be mandatory here in South Korea. Now, this comes after 3 full years of the pandemic. South Korean President Yoon made his debut at the Davos Forum 2023. There, he put an emphasis on South Korea's role in overcoming global threats and challenges. He also called for global solidarity and cooperation. China's progress report came out this past week too, and it's made for a gloomy reading. Its economy posted its slowest annual growth since 1976. Its population also dropped for the first time in 60 years. South Korea is also in the same shoes, as its population has gone downhill for the 3rd year in a row. Lifetime business class tickets between South Korea and Vietnam for Vietnam's head football coach Park Hang-seo. Vietnam Airlines gifted the coach the big surprise in recognition of his victories and contribution to football in the country. After leading Team Vietnam since 2017, the Korean coach closed his chapter of his career in Vietnam following the AFF championship. Frequently used words here in South Korea like oppa, a term used by females when referring to older males, must not be spoken or written in North Korea, as the regime has adopted a bill aimed at protecting Pyongyang's standard language. The measure is a part of the reclusive state's latest effort to tighten controls of overseas content and media coming into the north. South Korean leader Yoon wrapped up his first overseas tour of the new year. The trip included his debut at the 2023 Davos Forum. He delivered a speech, becoming the first South Korean leader to do so in 9 years, and Yoon's speech focused mainly on solidarity and cooperation. Let's turn to our Moon Kwan-young.
Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos Thursday, South Korean President Yoon called for solidarity and unity in safeguarding freedom and strong cooperation in addressing the many shared challenges the world faces. Among them, the formation of economic and security blocs, climate change, and health and digital divides. Free trade, he says, remains key.
자유무역 체제는 절대 포기해서는 안 되는 글로벌 공공재입니다. 장벽을 쌓고 보호주의를 강화하는 것은 결코 올바른 해답이 될 수 없습니다.
Although he said it was easiest to build ties with countries that share the same universal values, President Yoon also suggested Seoul was willing to engage with just about any country willing to cooperate with his nation. He referred to Japan as a nation that shares universal values, while in China,
체제가 다르거나 그 보편적 가치에 있어서의 많은 차이가 있는 국가들과의 관계를 배제하고 차단하는 그런 방식으로 운영될 것이 아니라 더 포용적이고 더 융합적인 그런 방식으로 운영돼야 된다고 생각합니다.
Highlighting South Korea's competence as a key partner in areas such as semiconductors and nuclear power generation and hydrogen, President Yoon also reaffirmed his nation's refocus on nuclear energy. Later in the day, the South Korean president met with quantum physicists at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich, where he discussed scientific and technological collaboration, including R&D. As President Yoon concludes his week-long tour of the United Arab Emirates and Switzerland, his office outlined the achievements made during this trip, which focused heavily on economic diplomacy.
During this tour around, we were able to secure $30 billion worth of investment pledge and ink 48 MOUs in the UAE and discuss $800 million worth of investment with foreign companies like Vestas, Merck Life Sciences, and Novartis.
Wrapping up his 8-day two-nation tour, which took him to the UAE for the first state visit for a South Korean president, and the Swiss alpine town of Davos for a special address to the World Economic Forum, Mr. Yoon now returns home, where he has a diplomatic tension to settle and a local economy to revitalize as Koreans head into Seollal, the Korean New Year's holiday. 문건영, Arirang News.
Before his debut at the Davos Forum, President Yoon Suk-yeol's first overseas stop in the new year was the United States Emirates. There, Abu Dhabi pledged $30 billion of investment in South Korean industries. Now, this is just a part of President Yoon Suk-yeol's fruitful state visit to the UAE. Our presidential office correspondent Moon Gan-young has more.
As UAE fighter jets paraded near the palace with red and blue smoke representing South Korean colors, President Yoon Suk-yeol met with his UAE counterpart Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan on the second day of his state visit to the United Arab Emirates, the very first state visit to the West Asian country by a South Korean president.
이제 양국이 새로운 리더십을 가지고 한국과 UAE 관계를 더욱 확대 발전시켜 나가야 됩니다.
During the hour-long face-to-face, the UAE announced its decision to invest $30 billion in South Korean industries, the largest investment ever by the UAE in a single nation. That decision, the UAE president said, was based on his confidence in South Korea that keeps promises under all circumstances.
During the time our nations have worked together, we've written a success story in setting a global example in the peaceful use of nuclear energy.
The investment, expected to be directed at nuclear power, defense, hydrogen, and solar energy industries, among others, also includes the 13 memorandums of understanding signed at the summit. One is an agreement between the state-run Korea Development Bank and the Abu Dhabi state fund Mubadala to cooperate for investment in South Korean companies.
To ensure swift and flawless execution of the agreement, we will provide our full support by creating an investment cooperation platform between South Korea and the UAE. This will enable the two sides to share investment information and enter partnerships more smoothly.
Yoon and Sheikh Mohammed agreed that their in-person meeting this time will serve as a key starting point for the two countries to elevate their strategic partnership and expand cooperation in new areas such as space development, health, culture, and people-to-people exchanges. 문건영, Arirang News.
보람에 is South Korea's first homegrown KF-21 fighter jet. Flying faster than the speed of sound, it successfully made its first supersonic flight. For more, let's turn to our defense correspondent, Oh Soo-young.
Just 6 months after its first test flight, the first fighter jet built independently by South Korea has gone supersonic. According to the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, the first prototype of the KF-21 보람에 aircraft surpassed the speed of sound, Mach 1, or about 1,200 km per hour, for the first time on Tuesday. Taking off from Sachon Air Base, the prototype flew at an altitude of about 40,000 feet over the country's southern waters and reached the milestone speed at around 3:15 p.m. Defense officials say the successful supersonic flight confirmed the aircraft's structural stability. It was able to withstand shockwaves and unstable airflow that typically hit the body of an aircraft when it breaks through the sound barrier. The test flight also marks a first for South Korea's defense industry, as the KF-21 is the country's first fighter jet developed completely with domestic technology. Defense Minister Lee Jong-sop called the flight a historic achievement, saying it lays the foundation for a stronger military, as well as paving the way for South Korea to become a major arms exporter. Seoul has been working on the KF-21 since 2015, pouring more than $7 billion into the project. It began flight tests in July last year. Having conducted more than 80 sorties so far, developers say they will continue to increase the altitude and speed of the aircraft, as well as improve flight stability, to make the KF-21 a full-fledged supersonic fighter. The country aims to finish developing the aircraft by 2026. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Now, moving on to China. China surely had a bumpy journey last year. The country's economy slowed sharply with its GDP growth among the worst on record. And its population also shrank for the first time in 6 decades. Our Kim Hyun-sung with the details.
China's population has fallen for the first time in 61 years. The population shrank by about 850,000 from the previous year, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics on Tuesday. And in 2022, the birth rate dropped to a record low, fewer than 7 births per 1,000, the lowest since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. China has also been seeing a shriveling working-age population. The number of people aged 16 to 59 has fallen by 50 million in just over a decade, going from a peak of 925 million in 2011 to just below 876 million in 2022. Authorities for years have been concerned about how the shrinking labor force will strain the Chinese economy, prompting policymakers to scrap the notorious one-child policy back in 2016. But it seems that move wasn't enough to turn around China's falling population. This news comes amid China's recent economic slump. China's GDP grew by 3% in 2022. It's the second weakest growth since 1976, only slightly better than the 2.4% growth seen in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Forecasters expect growth to bounce back to a moderate 5% this year, but there are some hurdles like slowing exports that could stop China from building momentum.
The foundation for the domestic economy to recover is not solid enough, and there are still quite a lot of challenges for the production and operation of companies.
The world's factory and second biggest economic powerhouse, China, is struggling to get its economy moving. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Now, the falling population is also ringing alarm bells in South Korea. The country's registered population last year dropped for the third straight year. Instead, the number of one-person households continued to rise. Our Shin Ha-young reports.
South Korea's population continued to fall in 2022, marking a decline for the third year in a row. Data from the Ministry of the Interior and Safety shows that the country's registered population as of December amounted to just over 51,439,000, with an on-year decrease of 0.39%. That's a drop of nearly 200,000 from the year before. By gender, the number of men dropped for a fourth consecutive year, while the number of women was down for the second straight year. The population gap between men and women widened to its largest level last year after the female population surpassed the number of males in the country for the first time in 2015. The total female population came to 25,802,000, with around 165,000 more women than men. Meanwhile, despite the fall in the overall population, the number of households increased by 1% from the previous year. This is due to a rising trend of people living alone. According to the data, the number of single-member households rose to over 9.7 million. An official from the Interior and Safety Ministry said the figure could hit 10 million by the end of this year. Combined with two-person households, in 2022, the two groups make up about 65% of the total. Based on a UN's classification, South Korea became an aged society in 2017 as the proportion of people aged 65 and older exceeded the standard of 14%. Last year, 20.1% of South Korean women were aged 65 or above, hitting the 20% level for the first time. Combined with the number of males aged 65 and over, the proportion of the two groups within the total population rose to 18%, further proof that the country is getting closer to the 20% required to be called a super-aged society. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
We've come a long way, and finally, wearing masks when indoors will no longer be mandatory, except when taking public transportation, going to the hospital, and visiting senior centers. Our Lee Dae-hyun has the details.
South Korea's indoor mask mandate will be lifted from January 30th. The decision was made during a Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters meeting on Friday. And from that day, mask wearing inside will be recommended rather than a requirement. It will take effect following this weekend's Lunar New Year holiday, with travel and family gatherings increasing during that period. And while mask wearing will no longer be mandated at most places, including schools, movie theaters, and restaurants, they will still need to be worn at facilities like hospitals, care homes, and on public transportation. During the meeting, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo said the decision came after a number of COVID-19 requirements, including the downward trend in figures for the deaths and the critically ill, were met. He added that there's a high possibility of a temporary increase in newly confirmed cases after the holiday, as cases rose at the same point last year. The Prime Minister said vaccination is vital to protect against any such increase.
With the lifting of the indoor mask mandate, vaccination has become more important. We advise unvaccinated people above 60 and elderly people living in vulnerable areas to get inoculated as soon as possible.
The decision means South Korea will no longer be the only country out of 38 OECD nations to fully require mask wearing indoors. 16 countries, including the US, Japan, and Canada, are free from wearing masks indoors. While in other countries, mask mandates are still in place at some facilities like medical centers and on public transportation. With the introduction of the new rules, South Korea will be left with just 2 COVID-19 restrictions still being enforced. 7 days isolation for confirmed cases, as well as masking up while at certain public facilities. Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says they are set to discuss reducing the number of days in isolation for those who test positive.
There have been related discussions here, and countries like Hong Kong and Japan are already having talks. Officials feel it's now time to start discussing shortening the isolation period as indoor mask mandates are lifted.
The official added they would gradually consider lifting isolation measures altogether, depending on whether the WHO decides to downgrade COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern, as well as changes to South Korea's own COVID alert level. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
코로나 한참 할 때 마스크를 벗으면 큰일 나는 줄 알았잖아요. 지금 마스크를 실내에서 마스크를 벗고 이런 데 대해서는 상당히 환영합니다. 저희들 코로나 격리라든지 이런 게 많이 완화됐잖아요. 그때 걱정을 많이 했는데 오히려 다 한번 순회하고 나니까 지금 잠정기에 접어들었잖아요. 마스크도 마찬가지라고 생각합니다. 네.
사람이 너무 많거나 이제 제가 개인적으로 기침을 한다던가 건강에 조금 이상이 있다고 생각되면 계속 끼고 다닐 생각입니다.
많이 답답하고 불안했던 점들도 많았었는데 지금은 그래도 어느 정도 익숙해지는 것 같아요. 근데 이게 코로나가 아예 없어지는 게 아니고 계속 이제 함께 가는 거잖아요. 그래서 그러니까 사람들이 그냥 익숙해질 수밖에 없는 것 같아요. 감기처럼. 네.
불편했지만 할머니 집에 갈 수 있어서 너무 좋았어요. 코로나가 심해져가지고 학교를 갈 수가 없어서요.
제가 21살 됐을 때 대학교 비대면 수업만 하다가 군대를 와가지고 대학교 이제 복학하면은 좀 여러 곳에 여행 다니면서 즐겁게 학교 생활 하고 싶어요.
좀 길기도 길고 짧기도 짧은 시간이긴 한데 3년이 좀 금방 가긴 했잖아요. 코로나 때 다들 힘들기도 했고 그래서 이제 곧 끝나간다 생각하니까 또 후련하기도 하고 좀 이런 바이러스는 이제 안 왔으면 좋겠기도 하고 그런 심정입니다.
Yeah, I want to make makeup and go outside. I will not wear mask.
As we've seen in previous reports, it's not an exaggeration to say that COVID-19 completely upended our lives for the past 3 years. To talk us through some of the ups and downs we faced, we have our Son Yujin in the studio. Welcome, Yujin.
Great to be back, Tommy.
All right, what a big announcement just in time for the Lunar New Year holiday. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, I remember you and me talking about over the possibility of lifting the indoor mask mandate, and it has come true. So let's talk about the public sentiment.
Well, first of all, Tommy, it's been 3 years since we start wearing masks, so it's quite hard to imagine ourselves without masks now, but still, a majority of Koreans have been waiting to go mask-free. A survey done by the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry late last month shows that out of the more than 1,600 Koreans surveyed, almost 3 in 4 were for scrapping indoor mask-wearing rules, and the main reason given was wanting to breathe freely.
Right, we've all accustomed to wearing masks, but I still miss the days when we didn't have to, right? And mask wearing is not the only inconvenience that the virus gave us. Think about all the border restrictions, mask mandates, testing mandates, and curfews, right? But it was tough, but now that I think of it, South Korea has done quite a good job handling the pandemic, right?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and we owe a lot to what is now being called the K-quarantine model. And to provide a specific explanation of that, it's South Korea's very own strategy of dealing with viruses based on the 3 T's. And by 3 T's, it stands for testing, tracing, and treating. And this model has been receiving a lot of attention and positive feedback from abroad. So I want to ask you, do you remember during the early days of the pandemic how people were lining in front of testing centers and screening clinics for hours just to get their COVID tests?
Let me tell you, I've wasted lots of hours on the road just to get tested. On weekends especially, it would take me hours just to get tested.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the main reason was because there weren't a lot of COVID testing centers when compared to now. And this actually increased the risk of getting infections because face-to-face contact between suspected patients and also the medical personnel was inevitable. And that's the reason why South Korea introduced the so-called drive-through testing stations. And here, drivers were able to pull into special parking areas where health workers would come to vehicles to check their temperatures and use swabs to take samples from their noses and throats. And this was a really big game changer because this entire process would only take about 5 to 10 minutes.
Right, from hours to just 5 minutes. That's a huge step. I do remember those stations were surely a big help to overwhelmed testing sites. Now, talking about COVID tests, South Korea also developed test kits too, right?
You're absolutely right. And South Korea actually standardized the usage of real-time PCR tests. And this RT-PCR test method, it really shortened the entire time of testing from about 1 to 2 days to 2 to 6 hours. So this was also a very big change in the COVID era. And these testing kits have now been exported to over 100 countries worldwide. And we also have to talk about the innovative tracing methods, particularly the QR code-based vaccine pass. And when we saw COVID case numbers surging, do you remember how we had to show our individual QR codes when entering restaurants, cafes, libraries, and all those public venues?
Right. Phone was a must-have, especially during those days.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I also want to talk about that overall, a lot of foreign outlets talked and praised about how Koreans were quarantining and wearing their masks so well. They especially highly evaluated Koreans for voluntarily staying home, refraining from taking part in mass demonstrations, traveling, and also holding church services online.
Right. We were able to get through those difficult times thanks to all the team effort between the general public and also the medical staff. Now, from the very first of the pandemic, they've been working nonstop, right? The medical workers.
Especially, right, we also have to talk about the contributions and efforts they have made, and especially when the pandemic first started and we saw case numbers skyrocketing, these medical staff, they had to literally work around the clock without weekends and holidays. So I want to ask you, do you remember the heartwarming thank you challenge?
Right. It was really heartwarming to see all the posts on social media expressing gratitude to those frontline medical workers. It was really nice.
And you're definitely right. And this campaign, it really received a lot of public recognition and it became really popular as a lot of well-renowned celebrities also took part in the challenge. And to name a few, it included the then South Korean President Moon Jae-in, Olympic gold medalist Kim Yeon-ah, and also, of course, K-pop sensation BTS.
That's right. Before we let you go, Eugene, lifting the indoor mask mandate doesn't mean we're done with COVID. I mean, as you yourself as a reporter out on the field, just keeping track of the COVID-19 situation here in the country, updating us from day one, what do you think we should be mindful of moving on?
Well, I just want to say that it's never too bad to be careful. We still have to wear masks on public transportation, at welfare and care facilities, and also in medical institutions. And health authorities will decide whether to scrap the mask wearing rules in these venues after monitoring the virus situation. And besides masks, vaccines have proven to offer strong protection. Health authorities have been encouraging people in the country to get the updated bivalent boosters, and they're known to be really effective, especially against the highly transmissible Omicron variant and its various sublineages. But currently, only a little over 12% of people aged 12 and over have gotten the jab, so maybe rolling up your sleeve and getting the vaccine might be a good protection method.
Right, starting January 30th, we don't have to feel so bad not wearing masks here in the studio, right?
Right.
All right, thank you so much for joining us again today, Eugene.
Always a pleasure.
That's all we have for this weekend's weekly news highlights. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.